just jumping right into it, right? The series we've been in has been called Growing Closer to God, right? And what we've been looking at in the series is what? Maybe things we can do to grow closer to God, maybe some actions. I'm glad it stuck with you. I'm excited that even though I was out for a couple weeks, that you guys are right there with it. So maybe a brief review is in order here. So we've talked about just the things that we can do, right? And what we find, right, is that it's a variety of things that help us to do that, right? That there's not a magic bullet sort of thing, right? That there are ways relationships help us to grow closer to God, right? Because as we try to grow closer to God, what are we trying to do? We're trying to have a relationship with God. And one of the ways that we grow closer in our relationship with God is our relationship with other people, right? There's personal relationships as we walk through life with other people that we know well or get to know well. We may study with them. We may kind of walk through life events with them. But as we kind of ride that journey with other people, that can help us to grow closer to God. You know, I think a lot of our relationship with ourselves can be a big part of that many of us can have this very dark, negative voice that plays inside of us all the time. You know, and when we kind of really focus on reaching out to God and through the power of Jesus and, you know, His Holy Spirit to help us free ourselves or be freed from that. I shouldn't say free ourselves, but be freed from that. There are times where the darkness and the weight weigh on us so heavy that we cannot find a way to break out on our own. You know, and one of the things I think is so important in the 12-step world, like for Alcoholics Anonymous and so forth, is that the very first step is this really important acknowledgement. I can't do it by myself. I've been trying to do that for years. It doesn't work. And we think of it again with chemical dependencies and other issues, but the reality is that all of us have things that hold on to us that we cannot get free of by ourselves. And it's kind of walking that out with people around us, with God, the power of Jesus in our lives that can help us to move past that. But also broader relationships are really important. I think a really important part of growing our relationship with God is service to other people. You know, reaching out and, you know, helping people around us who are needy, helping people who just have, you know, things going on in their lives. I mean, we do that through our food pantry, right? We do that through the soup kitchen. We do that through the school support, through the homeless support we do. And there's something that's really powerful in doing more than giving money, right? But actually showing up and walking, you know, in a journey and experiencing the difficulties that people have in their lives. It may be very different from our own difficulties. It helps us remember what we have, because it's really easy to sit back and whine and complain when you kind of have a myopic view of the world. But when you start to look at what you have and you see what other people might not have, it kind of helps remember that, you know, even though our life's not exactly what we want sometimes, that we have a lot of good things. There are a lot of blessings in our life. You know, and there are regular activities that are really useful with that as well, right? Like coming together on a Sunday morning. This is why you guys are my favorite, right? Because you showed up on the holiday weekend, right? You know, and I love everybody, but I love you guys a little more, just so you know. But coming together in worship really matters. Right? And you know, and just kind of worshiping with people who are like you, worshiping with people who are different than you. All those things come together. And then, of course, there are the personal habits. You know, things like reading our Bible daily and prayer throughout the day, right? All those things are important in our relationship with God. And so the thing that I wanted us to see throughout this series is that it isn't just one thing. I'll just repeat myself here. There is no one magic bullet. If I do this one thing, then I'll have this perfect relationship with God. You know, that'd be like saying that, well, I just do this one thing once and I'll have a perfect relationship with my wife. Right? Yeah, how's that going to go, right? I did something right once. That might actually be true in my case, though, right? You know, I don't want to puff myself up, but I did just something right once, you know, sort of thing. But all of these things come together. And what we're really doing, and that's the thing, that our relationship with God is this kind of lifelong journey of building that relationship. But the thing that's important, remember that in anything you build, the most important part of what you build is tied to the foundation. right? Everything we do when we build something stands on the foundation. And the same thing is true in our relationship with God. And what is the foundation of our relationship with God? It's Jesus, right? Our entire relationship with God is built on Jesus, the work of Jesus, the freedom that Jesus brings us, right? That the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus gave us this path to freedom. Freed from our sins, free from our failures, free from the things that we've just been it's kind of laid down on us. Now, we may not always feel free, but through Jesus, we are freed. And so I want to talk a little bit about that relationship with Jesus this morning. Now, you're kind of going, I thought we were doing the book of Ruth. And we are. But the thing that I want to kind of point to here is that as we kind of set this all up, we talked about the book of Ruth being this kind of really interesting book in the sense that it is an ancient book, right? It's from the Bible's Old Testament, right? As the Old Testament, that means it's a book written before the time of Jesus. Yet even though the book is so old, it actually gives us incredible insight in how we live our lives today. It gives us a lot of insight in our relationship with God, and it actually can show us a lot about our walk with Jesus. Now, again, because it's been kind of so long since we've talked about this, I want to give you a 90-second review of the first 3 chapters of the book of Ruth, just to kind of catch you up with where we are. Right? So basically, the book of Ruth takes place roughly 3,000 years ago. There's this woman named, any guesses? Ruth, right. There's Ruth is a kind of a key part of this narrative. But remember, the first person we met was another woman named Naomi. Naomi would have eventually become Ruth's mother-in-law. But if you remember that when we first met Naomi, it was her husband, and their 2 sons, and they lived in the city of Bethlehem. And this is the same Bethlehem that we associate with Jesus. As you might recall, there was actually a famine at one time there. So Naomi and her family decided to move to a faraway land known as Moab. Now, Moab was kind of an interesting place to go because for ancient historical reasons, there had been a lot of tension between ancient Israel and Moab centuries before this. But there were still some tensions there. Also, Moab was a pagan nation, meaning that they did not believe in the God of Israel, the God we would think of as God. As Christians, they had their own set of gods. But there was food there. So they kind of gone out there. They spend a lot of time out there. And over the years, Naomi's 2 sons, so Naomi, her husband, and 2 sons move out there. The 2 sons eventually grow up, and they marry local Moabite women. One of the sons marries Ruth. But as time goes on, kind of tragedy goes through the family. First, Naomi's husband dies. Then both of her sons die. And eventually it comes down to all that's left in the family here is Naomi and Ruth. And as we talked about that, in the ancient world, due to structural society issues, it was very difficult for women to be able to support themselves financially. So having no men in the family meant that they were facing poverty. And so they made the decision to head back to Bethlehem. Now, I say head back to Bethlehem, but that's only half true, right? Because for Naomi, it was heading back to Bethlehem. It was a familiar place. But for Ruth, Bethlehem was a foreign land. But if you remember, she said something to Naomi that was so important. She says, Naomi, wherever you go, I will go, and your God will be my God. That through her relationship with Naomi, she had come to know God and was now committed to that relationship. So they head back over to Bethlehem. They're in Bethlehem, still facing poverty, though. Right? The same structural issues still kind of exist. So Ruth says, well, what I'll do is I'll go out to the local fields and I'll begin to glean. And remember what gleaning is, right? Gleaning is this idea of trying to scrape out something to eat. Because what it means is that you're going to a farm field that has already been harvested from. And what you do is you walk along after it's already been harvested and just start checking all the plants, trying to find anything that's been left behind. And one of the things that we know is that only Ruth was able to glean. Naomi was not able to. We don't actually know why. We don't know if it was just advanced age or if she had some other issues. But what that now means is that Ruth has to go out and glean by herself and try to get enough food for both her and Naomi, a daunting task. But as she goes out to glean, she actually goes to a field belonging to a man named Boaz. And we learn very quickly that Boaz is a good man. He's a caring man. That he was a man of status. He was financially well off. And as she goes there and starts kind of coming along to kind of glean the fields, Boaz takes notice of her. And Boaz, being a kind man who was kind to his employees, was kind to folks who came around, tells his people who work for him, saying, I make this a bit easier for her. I don't want you to clean the plants up entirely. I want you to leave food behind to make it easier for her to get food. And so as we were wrapping up kind of in part 3, you remember that Ruth returns home to Naomi at the end of a long workday, and Naomi's expecting just a few scraps of grain, and Ruth effectively walks in with a 5-gallon bucket filled with grain, kind of ready to eat. And Naomi's like, where'd you go? And Ruth goes on to say that, well, I went to the field belonging to this guy named Boaz. And Naomi said, well, Boaz is an honorable man, a trustworthy man. Continue to work in his fields. You'll be safe there. He'll care for you. And then Naomi says to Ruth something that we kind of wrapped up on. He says, and oh, by the way, Boaz is our guardian redeemer. And I promise you that today I would tell you what a guardian redeemer is. And I will, but not yet. So as we kind of get into the story now, Ruth continues doing what she's doing. She's going out to the fields each day. She's collecting the grain that she can. Boaz continues to be kind to her. And in fact, we get the sense that there's even affection developing between Boaz and Ruth. Because beyond even kind of leaving food behind for Ruth, Boaz even invites her to come sit at mealtime with him and the other workers. So he's actually feeding her in addition to allowing her to collect from the fields. But this, as good as this is working out, time is going on. And can you harvest fields year-round? No. So the time of the harvest is beginning to pass. And what's going to happen when there's nothing to go glean anymore? Now, Naomi is well aware of this. And so Naomi tells Ruth something that's really important. She wants to give Ruth some guidance. And so as we jump into the scripture, it says that one day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to Ruth, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be provided for. In other words, that you've been going out every day and you've been working and you've been kind of gathering up the food that you can, but we're living day to day. We're just surviving from day to day. That I want you to find something better than that. And so that Naomi gives Ruth some advice. As we're getting to the end of the harvest season, Boaz and the people who work for him are now beginning to do a lot of the labor to kind of prepare the food for storage. And so all that work is going on. And Naomi knows that means that they will be working long hours such that they will even sleep where they're working. So what Naomi says to Ruth is, what I want you to do is that I want you to go over there, see Boaz, and tell him that you would like him to fulfill his role as our guardian redeemer. But Naomi advises her to do it kind of strangely. She says, make yourself look presentable, go over there, watch the workers. When everyone falls asleep, take note of where Boaz falls asleep and go over and talk to him privately. Now, the reason that Naomi does that is that if people saw Ruth walking up to him saying, basically, I'm desperate, I need your help, it would be belittling to Naomi. To Ruth. It's going to be belittling to Ruth. So she's basically advising Ruth to do this in a way that doesn't draw a lot of attention, so this can be a private exchange between her and Boaz. So Ruth does what Naomi advises. She actually gets kind of dressed up. You want to ask for help, might as well look good, right? Sort of thing. Heads out to where they're working, watches the folks work, watches them fall asleep, notices where Boaz is. And she goes over there, and she curls up by his feet and just kind of waits for him to wake up. And she waits, and eventually he rolls over, not expecting anyone there. And basically, he jumps up, and he's like, well, who are you? Like, who are you? Why are you here? What's going on right now? And Ruth says that, I am your servant, Ruth. And remember, I mentioned this before, that when she refers to herself as a servant, she's not being belittling. to herself, she's simply showing him respect, right? He's a man, worthy of respect. She's simply saying, I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. And this idea of kind of spreading the corner of the garment over me, it simply means that, would you bring protection to me? There are Psalms that talk about God like spreading his wings around us and so forth. So she's saying that will you provide security and protection to me? And he says that, that your role as a guardian redeemer of our family. So finally, what is a guardian redeemer? I'll tell you in pieces. No. Guardian redeemer actually is a legal term in their world. Remember, they live under Mosaic law, right? That's the law structure that the Old Testament puts in place. And the guardian redeemer is actually a role defined in the book of Deuteronomy. And the idea of it is that this is the ancient world. In the ancient world, people die a lot, right? Men can die because of disease, because of battle, because of famine, because of attackers. And the idea is that it was put into place to provide for remaining family members. That if a man dies and leaves a widow, a redeemer, a family redeemer can come along, and first of all, they can purchase the property. So all the property that belongs to that family, the redeemer takes their own money and buys the property. And the reason for that is so that the property stays in the family, to prevent the widow having to sell off all the property just to try to take care of herself. So he would come in and buy the property, and he would care for the remaining family members. So she goes up to him and says, would you do that for us? And Boaz is actually deeply moved as she asks him that question. But he says that I want to, but there's someone else who has a higher right to that than I do. Now, there's something we need to kind of infer here to understand what's going on. Right? The idea, if you go look at the actual rules for the guardian redeemer, try that again. Go look at the actual rules for a guardian redeemer in Deuteronomy, which I think it's Deuteronomy 25, but I'm not sure. If you look at the actual rules, the guardian redeemer actually only applies, as written in Deuteronomy, to the brother of a man who dies. So what it says in Deuteronomy is that if your brother dies, you should do these things. You should go buy the property and you should care for his family. But remember that, we have this tendency to look at the Old Testament as kind of like a really narrow set of time. But the Old Testament covers centuries and centuries. And so the time of Ruth is many centuries after the book of Deuteronomy is written. And what we can infer is that the culture decided that only taking care of your brother this way may not quite be enough, because people die a lot in the ancient world. And so it seems that what they've done is they've expanded the definition of guardian redeemer to include broader family members as well. And the idea is that whoever was the closest relationship to the person who had died, the man who had died, had, it's a weird thing to say, but first right of refusal. Right? The nearest relative could claim it. If he didn't claim it, someone further away could do it. And so Ruth kind of has all of her hopes built up because she doesn't know how any of this stuff works. And Boaz kind of gives her, well, I'd love to, but, well, I can't. And you got to think that her hopes were kind of dashed for a moment there. But Boaz doesn't give up easily. He goes, but I will deal with this for you. So he sends Ruth on her way home. He goes to sleep. The next morning he wakes up and does exactly what he promised. He heads out to the part of town where business gets done. Because again, we have to remember that this is the ancient world, so they don't have contracts the way we think of contracts. So the way a contract was actually solidified in that environment was that you would go to the part of town where the elders could be found, the town elders could be found, and then you would transact your business in front of those elders, and then they would attest that the contract had been established. So basically, Boaz goes out to that part of town, gathers the elders, waits for the man who is has the closest right to be a redeemer to come along. And then Boaz sees him and says, hey, come on over, friend, I want to talk to you. And as he invites him over, he actually tells him that, hey, I don't know if you've heard, But remember Naomi, the woman who her and her family had moved off to Moab, and her family died and she came back and now she's a widow? Well, Naomi is selling her husband's property. Notice, who does he mention? He doesn't mention the young, beautiful widow. He mentions Naomi. And he says, Naomi is actually, selling that property. And I would like to buy it, but if you don't, but you have first right. But if you don't want to buy it, I'll buy it. This is what Boaz says. And the guy looks at the situation. The other man looks at the situation. He's like, here's what he's hearing. Okay, she's a widow. Naomi's a widow. He clearly doesn't know what else is going on in Naomi's life. She's a widow. She's going to sell that property. Well, I can get that property at a really good price now. And all I have to do is take care of this old lady until she dies? What a deal, man. This is a big win for me. Naomi can't last much longer. This is what he's thinking. And so the guy says to Boaz, I'll redeem it. And then this next part, I'm going to add a little dramatic effect here. I picture Boaz going, by the way, I forgot to mention something. He says, then Boaz told him, of course, your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. Well, that sounds okay, right? That way she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. See, there's a bit more to the guardian redeemer than just buying the property and taking care of the family. One of the rules of being a guardian redeemer is that if the widow of the man who died has no children, you're responsible to marry her and give her children. Even if you are already married and have children, well, now you have two families. And the way it actually works, because remember, the purpose of the guardian redeemer is not just to keep the family safe, but it's to keep the family property, family property and other things from being split up. So the way it actually would work in this case is, as the redeemer, this guy is likely already married, already with children. He now has to take his money, buy the property, marry Ruth, give Ruth children, and then it's those children who inherit the property that he just bought. And that property is actually considered to belong to the man who died. And so it takes it as a very different situation where this other man initially looked at all that he was going to get from it, like, wow, this is a great deal for me. It turns out that what a redeemer actually has to do is pay the price to restore the family and to restore the family line. See, it's not about the redeemer getting the benefit. It's about the redeemer bringing restoration, and the redeemer pays all the cost of that restoration. And so what that means is that in order for this to happen, you've got to pay a cost. And once the man realizes that, he's not interested anymore. It looked like it was going to be a big win, but it was all about what he would get. And so he turns it down. And Boaz says, well, I'll do it. And then Boaz does. He actually pays the price to acquire the property. He marries Ruth. He actually takes care of Naomi. And he does all this knowing that he will receive no material benefit. But what has he done? He has paid the cost to bring Ruth into the family. And the thing that I want us to see is that is an exact representation of what Jesus does in our lives. Right? That each of us were away from the family, right? Until we made the decision to put our faith in Jesus, we were outside the family. We were in need of redemption. To take the metaphor kind of really far, just as Ruth is kind of going through day to day trying to survive, that's kind of where we find ourselves. But when Jesus redeems us, he pays that cost. And he invites us into the family. Now, the thing is that with Jesus, we're all facing this choice of a redeemer, right? Because we all have things in our life that we can either accept Jesus or we can lean on other things. Because this is what I was kind of talking about at the beginning, right? Is that we all have false redeemers in our life. Have you ever had anything in your life where you thought, man, if I just had that, I'd be set. If I just had another $1 or $1 million or whatever, right? If you know what? If I was sitting in a 12-step meeting one time, and a woman said to me one day, like, oh man, if I just had $1,000, I'd be set. And depending on what you have, $1,000 is a lot. But are you set? Does $1 million set? Guarantee for the rest of your life if no other money came in and everything possible happened, would $1 million be enough? No, right? There is no set. It might be money. You know, it might be I'm stressed out, and if I could just grab a drink and stop thinking about this for a bit, then I'd be set. I'd be clear-headed in the morning. Nah, I could be clear-headed in the morning. Right? That we all have a life where we have a choice of redeemers, right? That we are kind of like Ruth in that moment, where Boaz is on one side and this other redeemer is on the other. Right? There's this one that comes along and promising great things. I'll take care of it. It'll be perfect. I'll pull it all together for you. And if we choose that one, we end up dropped and disappointed, expecting things to happen that are not going to happen. Or we can choose Jesus, who actually brings us real redemption. I mean, we have all chased something. You know, I always kind of reference drugs and alcohol because that's kind of easy to picture. But we often do it with work, right? We've all like, man, if I just worked hard enough and got a high enough status and enough promotions, man, I'd be all set. Until one day the job's over and someone else is doing it now, and you're not all set. If I just had more stuff, I just had more money, right? We're all chasing something. And oftentimes the things we're chasing are trying to distract us from where we actually are. That we're trying to not think about where we are. And what Jesus invites us into is, as the true Redeemer, he allows us to find life and joy in where we actually are. The true Redeemer is not about escape. The true Redeemer is about fullness and fulfillment. Right? That through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we are redeemed. Right? The Apostle Paul puts it like this. He says, in Jesus we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he has lavished on us. Right? Jesus paid the price to redeem us. And why did he do it? I mean, it's not a mystery. Jesus actually tells us why he did it. He says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. That we could live a life where we're not trying to be distracted or not trying to hide out or not trying to run away. We can live a life where we are actually experiencing renewal, a rich, full life that begins in this life, a change in this life that goes on into eternity. Right? That's what Jesus invites us into. It's a gift we receive through him. And it doesn't matter where you are in your journey, that is available. And what we get kind of a picture of what becomes possible through a Redeemer if we kind of jump back to the Ruth and Boaz thing for just a second. As I said, Boaz pays the price to redeem Ruth, and the two of them get married. And through that one event, the world would never be the same. Because Boaz and Ruth would have a son, who would have a son, who would have another son. So Ruth's great-grandson, who was a guy named David. So the great-grandmother of David is the David that kills Goliath. Is the David who becomes the greatest king in ancient Israel's history. And it doesn't stop there, because generations later, King David would have a really well-known descendant. Who? Jesus. The descendant of David is Jesus. And if David is a descendant of Ruth, that means that Jesus is a descendant of Ruth. Right? Ruth, this woman who was seemingly unimportant, this woman who seemed to just barely scraping by survival. Right? This woman who grew up not even knowing who the God of Israel was, or the Christian God is, had no religious background, struggling to care for herself, becomes part of the family line of Jesus. That in her redemption, the path to our redemption descends from that. And the reality is that we all need a redeemer. We all need to make that conscious choice to choose Jesus as our redeemer. Paul, as he continues on, says this: for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Right? The bottom line is that we all have sinned. And I say this often, but I don't feel like I can say it often enough. When we talk about sin, it's not some rule book somewhere. There's not this list of, well, this is a sin and that's not a sin. Right? Sin is an easy definition. Anything we do that harms ourselves or someone else. Right? No one has to tell you when you're sinning. Right? No one has to tell me. I'm well aware I'm doing it. Right? Now, we may step forward or we may have to stop a minute and think back, but no one has to tell us when it's happening. And we've all done it. And when we do that, we harm a child of God. So we incur a debt to God. And just like Ruth, we had a debt that we could never repay. But just as Ruth did not have to repay her debt herself, her Redeemer did it. That's what we have, right? We don't have to pay it ourselves. Paul goes on to say, all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. Jesus is our Redeemer, right? He is the one to pay the debt. And with that, we get this gift of renewed life. I mean, think of the transformation in Ruth's life. She goes from living literally hand to mouth to being married to this incredibly wealthy, powerful man. And we are in the family of an incredibly wealthy, powerful man. He owns every cattle on every hilltop. And he invites us into a life of fullness and joy. And that's the thing I want to say here as I finish up. Right? That this idea of growing in our relationship with God is interlocked in growing in our relationship with Jesus. Right? That we are invited into a life of transformation. Right? And that is the foundation of everything that we do. That in the power of our relationship with Jesus, in that foundation, we do all the other things that we've talked about over the past few weeks. And in that, we grow and we get renewed and we have freedom. And we can share that with others so that they can have freedom. And collectively, what we're doing when we share that message, what we're doing when we accept that message, is we are becoming part of the family of Jesus, part of the family of God.